All right, so we're talking about seam allowance. What is seam allowance? It's the area of fabric between the raw edges of fabrics and your line of stitches, a plain seam right here. So in regular clothes, if you flip your clothes inside out, you will see this. Here's a store-bought garment, piece of clothing I have for you to see. So you can see there's a line of stitches right here, and it's the same color thread, so it might be a little hard to see. There's a line of stitches, and then there's a seam finish on there, which we'll get to next. But if I open this garment up, see that seam right there? That's where the seam is. On the inside, there's a little bit of a buffer area between the raw edge of the fabric and where the stitches are. That's for security, and so your garment will last and it will be well made. So remember, the raw edges is just a cut piece of fabric. There's no finishing on it. It's rough, it frays. When you're sewing together a plain seam and creating things, you're going to have probably two pieces of fabric you're going to put together, and you have to stitch them together. So your seam allowance would go here. Well, how do you know what right measurement it is for the seam allowance? So on your needle plate, there are guides for how to achieve proper seam allowance in common projects. So we have the 1/4 of an inch does not exist on the needle plate. It's the edge of this presser foot. Then the engraved markings go on to 3/8, 4/8, 5/8, and 6/8 on your plate. This right here, this shows that there's 10, 15, and 20 millimeters. Those are in the metric system. We won't be using those, but those are what they are on your machine. Here is a cheat sheet guide for your needle plate to how to position your fabrics to achieve a proper seam allowance based on what the instructions say. Here's your ruler worksheet so you know how your ruler works. This is referring to this ruler, so you can use this ruler to find a proper seam allowance on your fabrics. This is the seam allowance worksheet. So this worksheet, you're going to achieve 4 different measurements for seam allowance. We have a 1/4 of an inch. We have 3/8 of an inch. We have a 1/2 an inch. And we have 5/8 of an inch. So make sure you have back stitches on all of it, because if you don't have any back stitches, watch what happens if you don't have a back stitch on a seam. So this measurement is nice, but there's no back stitches. So watch what I can do. That seam is not secure. It's not going to last. You're going to pop a hole in that seam. So don't forget your back stitches when you do seams. Another thing you want to avoid is doing a very tiny seam allowance like this. This is not good. This is too small to do a finish on, and this is too small to be secure and good for a longevity of a piece of clothing or a project. So you can already see the thread doesn't have enough fabric to hold on to. That's the key with the seam allowance. You want the thread to have enough fabric to hold on to, and this one simply doesn't. Now if you look at this 1/4 example, if I open that up, that's nice. That's what you want, okay? All right, now, what do we do about all these raw edges? That is in your next allowance, or that's in your next lesson. But that is seam allowance, and now we're going to move on to seam finish.